Namaste. Good morning. Okay, this isn't the first time I've ever done this, so bear with me. Welcome to my new live streaming project. I'm going to be reading to you from a variety of books. The ones I have in mind, the first one I have in mind is Brave New World. I'd like to start doing a nightly reading of from Brave New World, not necessarily whole chapters at once, but some substantial chunks of reading. Brave New World is one. The Yoga of Power is on my list, and I'm going to start with Spaciousness, the radical Dzogchen of the Vajra heart, Longchenpa's precious treasury of the Dharma Dhatu. Translation and commentary by Keith Dowman. I'll start with his preface. This translation may appear to some readers as a finished work of English composition reflecting Longchenpa's Tibetan original. This is far from the truth. Longchenpa's Treasury of the Dharma Dhatu is a masterpiece of poetic mystical revelation and requires a mind of similar luminosity to render it into English. Longchenpa's major works comprise only a fraction of the mystical masterpieces of Tibetan Buddhism that require translation with a pitch of resonance and height of evocation similar to the King James Version of the Bible. We need Western Longchenpas to rewrite this perennial mystical experience in an authentic language ringing true from the first word to the last. We have expunged a lot of the tired English argot argo that was contrived originally to translate the Mahayana Sutras and Shastras, but we still have a long way to go before Dzogchen texts shine in the great tradition of English poetry and of T.S. Eliot or Jack Kerouac. And it is the poetry that matters as much as, or even more than, the philosophical content. The academics are necessary and useful, but our best hope for Dzogchen texts lies with the yogin poets, even if that implies expanding the scope of transmission to include a far wider audience. Does this approach vitiate the lineage in any way? Does it permit unscrupulous charlatan or psychopathic teachers to preempt the closed circle of Dzogchen lineage holders in a susceptible, credulous New Age market? What of the New Age Dzogchen imitators who have obtained their knowledge from books and study? Should they be welcomed as homegrown, self-realized, non-dualist Dzogchen adepts? Lineage in Dzogchen is synonymous with the ground of being, but is it the sine qua non for other non-dual teachers? And then the issue of samaya. We must accept that subsequent to initiatory experience, until a student has assimilated and familiarized him or herself with the view, secrecy, or at least discretion can be extremely valuable as a hedge against energy leakage and conventional deleterious prioritization. Yet, since the heart teaching is always self-secret, dissemination of the Dzogchen view and celebration of the great significance of non-meditation need not be circumscribed by the teacher's personal vow of secrecy. Due to poor presentation, some recipients of the view may find their egos inflated by it, but for most recipients, the view is ego-destructive and undermines and resolves the manipulative, dualizing intellect. This is another alternative translation of the seminal Dzogchen text, Chos Jibing Dzod, which is the Tibetan master Longchenpa's masterpiece. The first publication of this work in 2001 under the title The Precious Treasury of Basic Space may yet prove to be a turning point in the history of Dzogchen in the West. A group of Western Dzogchen practitioners who had not absorbed Dzogchen in its Oriental home translated and published the supreme classical work of Dzogchen under the auspices of a Rigzin Lama and with the assistance of Khenpo scholars, but essentially inspired by their own existential understanding. Dzogchen was thus reclaimed by the people who need it from the caretakers who can no longer use it in the cultural context in which it evolved. Surely we should hope that Dzogchen retains a deep sacred place within Tibetan consciousness, but our principal aspiration is for Dzogchen to take root in the West and heal the deep rifts that Judeo-Christian dualism has created, Judeo-Christian dualism has created in the meta-structural consciousness of the people of the book. In order for this to occur, the supra-cultural meaning of Dzogchen should be lifted by its existential bootstraps out of its monastic isolation and primping cultishness into the clear light of day, where it can be embraced by the existential and literary mainstream that is open to a non-dual view of the world. This translation attempts to move literary Dzogchen exposition in that direction. Dzogchen must leap out of the academies into the lives of the people on the ground who aspire to live it, or rather, who are struggling to live it as through a glass darkly without the benefit of the heart teaching. Governed now by an elitist group of linguists and sectarian commercial publishers on one side, and covens of secretive esoteric practitioners on the other, Dzogchen risks becoming lost in an impenetrable sectarian labyrinth. The religious history of Tibet had its own necessary religio-political logic that banished Dzogchen to a secret underground status. The needs of the West surely require quite a different upshot. Longchenpa's work, like this one, allows the possibility that scientists, the high priests of a post-Christian society, particularly the physicists, can recognize the apex of Buddhist thinking as a corollary of their own. Dzogchen texts and Western commentaries should be accessible to psychologists, particularly cognitive psychiatrists and Gestalt psychologists, to physicists, particularly particle and quantum physicists, and philosophers. From East Asia, Zen, Chan, and Taoism have created a profound wave of spacious, inseminating attitudes and vibration flooding through the thinking of many Western disciplines. Dzogchen is set to crown that tendency. A similar statement could be made about the influence of Advaita Vedanta and Kashmiri Shaivism upon the West. But Dzogchen will eclipse their influence because of the breadth of its view, the rationality and scope of its mysticism, the lucidity and clarity of its texts, and the deep roots and vitality of its tradition. Not only should scholars be released and absolved from their stranglehold on Dzogchen exposition, But the conservatism of Tibetan holders of the tradition should also be given a rest. As conservators of the Vajrayana tradition in general and Dzogchen in particular, the Tibetan Rigzins and Tulkus could not be surpassed. Even the Holocaust of the Chinese Cultural Revolution could not destroy what they had preserved in scripture and in oral transmission for as much as 1,200 years. Now, in the exile environment, limited nationalistic thinking may defeat the purpose of their Dharma when non-Tibetan people hungry for the vital meaning of non-dualism need the transmission so urgently. This assumes that the Dzogchen mindset goes a long way to resolving the world's ecological, political, and economic problems. It would be tragic indeed if Dzogchen were to remain the exclusive prerogative of those with birthright and thereby allow it to perish within the inevitable death throes of autochthonous Tibetan religious culture. What Western consumers of Dzogchen require from the Tibetan lamas are the qualities that Dzogchen espouses: detachment, openness, spontaneity, kindness, and an inclusive, supportive fellowship. With condescension, self-serving, or tight-fisted protectiveness, or an acquisitive business attitude, the bud on the bough is likely to wither before spring is out. Like economic protectionism, spiritual isolationism is counterproductive, like shooting oneself in the foot. As a codicil to that, I reflect that my own root gurus, although sustaining a genuine front of traditionalism, in my perception were infinitely flexible, bountifully generous, and graciously supportive, but that was at an earlier, more humbling, more auspicious time. In conclusion, we congratulate Richard Barron for his groundbreaking translations of Longchenpa's Seven Treasuries and honor Chagdud Tulku among Tibetans for his rare faith in his Western disciples' understanding and realization. Just as a crystal once grown in an experimental laboratory can thereafter more easily be grown in another far distant laboratory, so once a text has been opened by one translator, it is made immensely more accessible to others. If Dzogchen is Tibet's greatest gift to humanity, those who can should work together to share it without stint. Keith Dowman, The Great Stupa, Bauta, Kathmandu, Losar, Water Snake, 2013. That's the year. So that was his preface. Next, I have the introduction, but I have to open my yoga class here on Zoom. I might have a student joining me, in which case I'll have to cut this spontaneous live stream short, but I will continue. If I can get through, see, that took me a little bit longer than I thought. It takes a lot of energy to read these big words and to process the meaning. So let me plan to get through the introduction first. It's several more pages than the preface was. So bear with me. This is my first attempt at a live stream. And I also am opening my Zoom class for a potential student. So I might have to go grab a cup of water. If you want to practice Ashtanga Yoga with me, send me a DM. All right, I think, let me just hit a couple buttons here. The video is working, obviously. Okay, so to continue. Introduction. This famous seminal text of radical Dzogchen provides a profound yet simple poetic statement of how it is to immerse oneself in the matrix of the now, to allow pure presence and recognize Buddha. It is a personal statement of a yogin adept who evidently has passed through the throes of transfiguration. Certainly, the magic of his poetry impresses us that way, and surely this treasury of the Dharmadatsu, the Choying Zo, is a personal revelation of the consummation of Dzogchen. In it, we are assured that over and above all the yogas and dhyanas of Hindustan, all the ritual and magic of Tibet, and all the commercialized quasi-religious New Age therapies of the West, there exists a simple, timeless manner of being, of easy access, requiring no onerous technique or renunciate lifestyle that can give us a constant modicum of satisfaction in this vale of tears between birth and dying. This magnum opus of Longchen Rabjampa is a textbook of what has become known as radical Dzogchen, so-called in distinction to latter-day elaborated Dzogchen. It is a root text of those who have come up through the ranks of Buddhist practice, and that includes most Tibetans who are familiar with it, and most Westerners who have prior meditation experience on the graduated path. Even more so, it is a textbook for those who have encountered Buddhism at this, its apex point, through the instruction of those few lamas who promote Dzogchen distinct from its Buddhist context, or who have had personal initiatory experience outside any institutional frame. Its clarity in pointing out the natural great perfection is unsurpassed. Its absence of pedantry and didacticism and its fullness of poetic diction make it a paean of personal revelation, a naked revelation of a Buddha yogin come poet. The Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist arena historically is riven in a multitude of ways. Between the four schools, for instance, and between the old and new propagations, between monastic and lay practitioners, between the shamanic and the reformist, between central and eastern provinces, and not least in significance is the gap between monastic academics and lay yogins. To appreciate these two extremes of lifestyle and attitude, compare Je Tsongkhapa, the great Gelugpa literary exponent of the monastic reformist tradition, with Drukpa Kunle, the wandering Buddhist sadhu Ngapa, minstrel, magician, philanderer, the Dzogchen adept and poet. No love is lost between these two modes of spiritual exemplar, a tendency that is carried over to the West, where both Tibetan and particularly some Western academics pour militant scorn upon their experientially inspired, more demonstrative and less intellectual brothers. The monks who were the butt of his teaching jokes basted Drakpa Kunle. Of course, academics talk while yogins walk the Dharma. And academics extol and cultivate the very faculty that Dzogchen yogins seek to deflate and mitigate. Arrogance is the natural corollary of intellectual accomplishment, while humility arises automatically in the adept's mind through his unfurnished lifestyle. But as Dzogchen Rinpoche famously advised, the Dzogchen adept must be alert to the danger of attachment to alcohol and fornication. The academics as well as adepts have enormously enriched Tibetan culture is indisputable. What needs to be stressed is that the apex of Vajrayana exposition is revealed where yoga as existential accomplishment and literary exposition as poetry coincide. This middle way place, halfway between monastery and chung house cum brothel, is the Hermitage, not so much a place of rigorous ascetic discipline as a place of spiritual freedom. Here we can find the finest analytic and expressive minds and the very broad and profound, all-inclusive view incorporated in the single embodiment that is Buddha. Saraha exalted the tradition in India. Milarepa was Buddha, a Tibetan of the Himalayan littoral. Another, in the Dzogchen tradition, the finest, was Longchenpa. The treasury of the Dharmadhatu is the most explicit and keenest of the expositions of his own experience of Dzogchen Ati Yoga. He stresses himself the personal nature of what he describes. The real Dzogchen experience is beyond description and expression, so what he writes is, of course, a personal elaboration. This all-inclusive view that is the reality of radical Dzogchen is not dependent upon any religious culture, although the priests of the Buddhist and Bon religions of Tibet have been the custodians and occasional exemplars of it. For that, we owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, which is now being repaid by patrons and disciples in the Dharma centers throughout the world, and an even greater debt for investing us in the West in their vital tradition, repaid by our recognition of the nature of mind. But radical Dzogchen is, after all, as the tradition affirms, what we have always known. We know the inimical truth of being, along with all human beings who listen to their deep heart's core, and at the same time open their eyes to what is there in front of their faces. We know it in the same way that we know the pulsing of the blood in our veins and the touch of the in-breath and the out-breath on our nostrils. The truth of Dzogchen is the legacy of being human, but Judeo-Christian theism and Manichaean dualism have persistently obstructed such direct knowledge. Non-dualism proscribed as heretical, and Christian culture has never been able to articulate it sufficiently to create an integral lineal tradition, either covert or secular. Nevertheless, the non-dual reality of Dzogchen shines through European literature and poetry by other means. It is evident in popular culture, or is it most particularly evident in pop culture? And the truth dawns that it is the heartbeat of all culture. By virtue of the counter-cultural revolution of the 60s, moreover, insofar as the communal mind was opened and made receptive to the profound blast of radical Dzogchen, Today we have access to texts such as those of Longchenpa, each containing an identical vision like pixels in a hologram that simultaneously mirror and irradiate disparate visions in the minds of innumerable people around the world. The yoga of the Vajra heart, Maha-Ati, the apex path, is not part of the ninefold schema of progressive Nyingma Buddhism, and yet it infuses all 9 aspects. Longchenpa introduces it as an ultimately transcendent view that lies outside the narrative of the 9 paths and outside the conventional frame that includes Ati Yoga. In so doing, he provides a rationale for the perception of Dzogchen independent of its Buddhist context, a separable and discrete discipline. Such a perspective is key to the radical Dzogchen view. The recognition of the nature of mind is predicated upon the introduction from a master, whether he is a Buddhist or Bon Rigzen Lama, and regardless of his religious faith or whether indeed he is of a religious or secular disposition. On the other hand, in some cantos within this poem, Longchenpa appears to identify the apex view with Ati Yoga, the 9th path. The distinction here is to be made between instantaneous Dzogchen, perceived as simultaneous starting point and destination, wherein no graduation within a space-time frame can be admitted, and Dzogchen as a short, momentary path, a doorway into the nature of mind in space-time. At its essence, Ati Yoga may be conceived as either Trekcho or Togal, the 2 slightly differing facets of Dzogchen. The question whether the apex view is identical to the Trekcho and Togal views is one of those false questions posed by the intellect as a last defense against ego loss. If this question prepossesses us, we need to fall back into the spaciousness of the thought and allow the non-duality of non-action to reassert itself. If the intellect, rejecting that response as a placebo, insists on a rational answer to the question, why, when the Dzogchen view insists that there is nothing to do we need to engage with the techniques of Trekcho and Togal? Again, the answer is non-action. But what then of the outer and inner preliminary practices and the Trekcho Togal non-meditations? What of the formulations of the view under which the treasury of the Dharmadhatu can be subsumed? Yes, the Vajra heart is the immediate recourse of those who, like the great Garuda bird, spread their wings upon hatching, take off into the azure sky, and never look back. Ati Yoga, conversely, is the treasury of concepts and modalities that are the wide open doorways to serendipitous integration. In order to fall into the self-sprung understanding, sorry, I just lost my place, that the distinction between relative and absolute is purely intellectual and delusive, there must be a concept, a doorway that is understood as non-dual. That concept, and others denominated by its synonyms, is understood as a doorway into non-duality. The experience of walking through the door is like opening a door to the outside and allowing the air outside to merge with the air inside. While having the eyes open and looking, it is the experience of suddenly seeing. While dreaming. It is the sudden recognition that we are dreaming. So long as these exercises and concepts are considered functions of non-action and thus doorways into the non-dual, we remain in the realm of radical Dzogchen. The moment that any technique is conceived as a method providing a cause or condition for the realization of the natural state of mind, we enter the progressive gradualist cultural path that is usually taught by the lineal protagonists of latter-day Dzogchen to those they believe cannot comprehend the rigorous precepts of radical Dzogchen. Okay, I'm gonna take a break. I ate too many edibles. My blood sugar is making it hard to read. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Spaciousness, the radical Dzogchen of the Vajra heart. Longchenpa's Precious Treasury of the Dharma Dhatu, translation and commentary in this introduction and preface by Keith Dowman. I'm trying not to interrupt when I'm actually reading the text with any sort of, maybe a little laugh or like meaningful look, but trying not to speak or comment on my opinion of the text too much as I'm reading. But before and after, and these like little breaks in between, I kind of can address some points. I've actually was introduced to Dzogchen by Keith Dowman. I met him in Portland, Oregon. My Ashtanga teacher, Casey Palmer at Near East there, turned me on to him. So I volunteered in order to attend his weekend seminar there in Portland a couple of times. I've practiced with him maybe 3 or 4 times, I think now, also on Zoom a couple of times since 2020. So when I first saw Keith Dowman, I was checking in the attendees as my kind of trade for attending. And he came around the corner and he was literally, my first impression was he's literally glowing white. He had a radiant white aura. I don't think I can say that about anyone else that I've ever seen. I've practiced also, I spent 4 or 5 weeks, or 5 or 6 weeks, I don't recall, in Dharamsala or in McLeod-Ganj, where I got that tanka, little tiny tanka painting. Poor girl's tanka up in McLeod-Ganj while I was studying with, excuse me, a little bit dizzy, with Kemtrul Rinpoche. So that is in the Nyingma lineage of Vajrayana Buddhism. I took refuge with Kemtrul Rinpoche there and was allowed to attend private teachings, with a small group on in the Chod ritual, which is a very esoteric and advanced and kind of known to be dangerous ritual of kind of a selflessness, the Chod ritual. I'm not very qualified to speak on these things. I attended those teachings for a couple weeks. That one, Chod, and also the other one was in the 100,000 preliminary teachings, preliminary practices. The word for it is slipping my mind right now, the Tibetan words. Anyway, so Keith Dowman is one of the foremost teachers in Dzogchen, probably one of the single most. Of course, there are Tibetan teachers that are in a long lineage. And it's kind of intense to read this stuff. the actual poem itself is coming up. So I hope you are enjoying this and stay with me. I'll try to do more a little bit later today. And maybe I'll do the full Canto 1, the first part of the poem, this afternoon. So please join me. And like I said, I'll be reading from other books, but I want to finish, maybe work on maybe those 3 that I mentioned at the beginning, and then move on to other books, Brave New World and the Yoga of Power. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining me and for remembering how important it is to preserve literature and antinomian ideas. Namaste.